My name is Marianne Scott. I was born in Sacramento, California, but I only lived there for 3 months. I was born on December 28th, 1963.
So can you just describe a little bit about your family?
Sure, happy to. So I am probably one of the lightest skinned black women you have ever met. And that is because I am biracial. My mom is white American and my dad is African American. And they met in college. They met out at Stanford University. My dad had actually grown up, he was born in Chicago, but he'd grown up on the campus of Lincoln University, which is an HBCU in Pennsylvania, and had done his first 2 years of studies there. And he and my grandparents realized that he needed to get out of small town Pennsylvania. And so Stanford was, at that time, back in the days when you would get these things in the mail that had like the catalogs about the universities. And back at that time, so this would have been in the late 50s, it was one of the only big universities that actually featured black people in it. And so my grandmother was like, all right, if you're not going to be at this HBCU here, then we'll send you out there. So send them out to California. And so that's where my parents met. My mom was from Los Angeles. And
she was also
she was also
at Stanford.
at Stanford, exactly. So she was on a National Merit Scholarship and had gone there. And so she'd grown up in LA and then went up to Northern California. And when they met and decided to get married, they were young. They were right as they were finishing college. And my mother's parents threw her out for marrying my father. So they said that nobody was going to want those ugly mulatto children. They said that this was not a good marriage for her, and they erased her completely from the family history. So I grew up in a family with my white mother and my grandparents and my brothers and sisters, but very much in a black family, because my mother's parents had erased her so completely from her own family. And my grandparents, who the ones who my grandfather was vice president at Lincoln, they accepted my mother, and they said, she has given up everything for you, for my dad, for Austin. And so they embraced her and took her into the family, which is really the history of biracial mixing in a lot of the United States for a long time, where you would end up with kids who had one white parent who were thrown out of the white side of society and welcomed into the black side of society.
So tell us a little about your grandparents, and of course this will be on the black side.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I never knew my mother's parents.
I
I did get a chance to meet her. So my mom was the eldest, and then 11 years later, her parents had 3 more children. So when she went off to college at 17, she had a sister who kind of remembered who she was, but her youngest brother was, I think, 6 or 8 weeks old at that time. He was just a baby. So he didn't even know he had an older sister until he was an adult, when somebody finally said, yeah, oh, by the way, you have an older sister. And she was thrown out of the family because she married a black man.
Did she meet?
Yes.
So eventually
the
siblings met.
Exactly. Eventually, so it was my mother's sister who had always remembered her. And when she was having children, she actually was the one who told her mother, I know that you have other grandchildren that you don't even recognize. I want to talk to my sister. And my mother's parents had her phone number. It's still the same phone number at the house where my sister and brother-in-law still live. I now live across the street here in DC because we moved here to DC in '68. And it's still the same phone number that has been for all of those years. Yeah, exactly. That's an old phone number. So my mother did meet up with her parents just before they died. And then it's been her siblings who have really now gone out of the way to get to know my mother's grandchildren, so the next generation. So I have a daughter who's 26, who is the oldest grandchild, and then there are other, I've got a bunch of nieces and 1 nephew as well. So my mother's siblings really have gone out of their way to try to make sure that our kids feel welcome and that they're part of that family. But on my father's side, My grandparents were really quite extraordinary. So they actually met in Chicago. My grandmother.
Before we go there, I want to know. So, did your mother speak to you about the reunion with her parents at all?
Not really. Not really. We didn't, to be honest, this was when I was in end of college, and she did ask us if we wanted to go meet them, and we all said no. That was like, if she wanted to go, then that was fine, but we had no interest at all. And then they died not too long after that.
So now let's come to your grandparents.
So,
on your
the people who I consider my grandparents,
Exactly.
right? The others are my
Yes.
mother's parents, but
That's
these are
right.
my grandparents. And they met in Chicago at the University of Chicago. So my grandmother is from South Carolina, from Charleston is where she grew up, and from a family that really, really prized education. So my great-grandfather, her father, was one of the first black principals in Charleston, and David Hill. And during those days when my grandmother, who was born in 1910, was in South Carolina, there were no public high schools for African Americans. And so she went to the Quaker schools, the normal schools, which were the schools that had been set up, and then went to Atlanta to go to first it was Clark Atlanta, but then that became a graduate school, so she ended up getting her bachelor's degree from Fisk. So here's a woman born in 1910 who's one of very few graduating in chemistry from Fisk. And then she went to Chicago to get a graduate degree. And so this was at a time when very few women in general, much less black women, had graduate degrees in the United States. And at the University of Chicago is where she met my grandfather. And so.
And she studied chemistry there?
No, she did math and sociology. So once she got married, and then they moved to Pennsylvania. So Horace Mann Bond, who was the long-term president of Lincoln University, the father of Julian Bond. So it was Horace Mann Bond who asked my grandfather to come with him to Lincoln to be able to be the kind of the business manager, the vice president for administration, I think is what it was. So he took my grandfather and the family to Lincoln, and then my grandfather stayed there for decades and decades. So I remember as a kid going to Lincoln to visit my grandparents before my grandfather retired from there.
So your grandmother came from South Carolina?
She was from South Carolina.
And your grandfather?
I don't know as much about my
Okay.
grandfather. It's really been my grandmother's side of the family that we've gotten to know, and all of the extended cousins and aunts and uncles that I know are all on my grandmother's side of the family, not on my grandfather's side of the family. My grandfather passed away when I was in college of cancer. So I didn't have as long with him, but my grandmother lived until 100. And all of her siblings as well lived into, I think the one died at 98 and everyone else passed 100. So yeah.
Good
So they were,
genes.
yeah, very good genes. So they were around for quite a while.
So then what did, so they were at the University of Chicago, what did they do after they got their degrees? Meaning your grandmother?
So then they moved to Lincoln.
Lincoln. Did
And
she
then,
teach?
so she was teaching, so she had raised 2 children,
Yes.
and she taught math for quite a while.
At Lincoln?
Not as a professor, no, as
No.
in the high school or
I
the
see.
middle school, I think it was nearby. So she became a middle school math teacher. My grandfather was pretty conservative in terms of what a woman's role was, and she was supposed to be raising the children, and she had 2, my dad and my uncle, and she was like, that's enough, like, I don't need any more. But she did teach middle school math.
And what was it? What was their neighborhood? What was the setup?
So it was the campus, they lived on the
They
campus of
lived
the
on
university.
the
They lived on the
campus,
campus, so the Bonds, Julian and James Bond, Julian Bond and James Bond, lived in one house and they lived next door. So my dad and my uncle, David, so there were 2 Bond boys and 2 Scott boys, and they grew up together on the campus in what must have been faculty housing. My memories of that as a kid are of the blackberry and raspberry bushes in the back. So going, like, I guess it would have been during the summer to visit my grandparents, and more than anything, I remember these, what were then gigantic bushes of blackberries and raspberries, and having my grandmother let us go out and pick the berries. But, you know, I would have been like 5, 6, something like that. So.
What are your recollections of just you know, here you have a white mother and an African American father. What was it like growing up?
So we moved to DC in '68, and that's because my dad was the first black reporter hired by the Associated Press, and so he was actually hired in Sacramento, which is how hired, I guess, out of Stanford, first job in Sacramento. That's how I and my older brother were born in Sacramento. They then moved him to New York, and we were in New York for 4 years. And then they moved him to DC and to cover the civil rights movement. So my dad was one of the leading AP reporters who was covering the civil rights movement, but with a white wife, they couldn't really move them very far into the South, because my parents' marriage was only legal in many states in the United States in 1967. And so there were still a lot of, even though the Loving decision in the Supreme Court had made their marriage legal, there were still a lot of different regulations within different states that controlled what biracial couple could do or couldn't do. And so one of these, so we are 4 kids. My older brother and me, and then my sister, and then my parents decided to adopt in New York. And so my youngest brother, who passed away last year, unfortunately, was all not biracial, 100% African American. And when they were moving to New York down to DC, Virginia and Maryland had laws that you couldn't have a biracial couple adopting a child. And so it had to be DC that we had to live in. And we continued to live in DC. We're very much focused on coming up in DC. So where we ended up growing up in DC was the Tacoma, DC neighborhood. And it was part of so if you think of the map of Washington, DC, east of Rock Creek Park in the upper north side was quickly turning all black back in the late 50s and the 60s. West of the park stayed, to this day, predominantly white. But up in that Tacoma, Shepherd Park, Manor Park area of DC, there was a group of neighbors that had gotten together called Neighbors Inc. And they specifically got together to try to create integrated neighborhoods. So this was a time when you had real estate agents and others trying to encourage white families to flee to the suburbs because African American families were moving in. And of course, the real estate agents would be the ones who would be profiting from this.
Can you give us a year, kind of a time frame?
So '68 was when we moved in, and Neighbors Inc. had started several years before that, but my mom found the house through Neighbors Inc. So I don't know how she got connected to them, but it was this organization that she realized that in terms of raising a biracial family, raising black children, that she wanted to make sure that we were in a neighborhood where we would be welcomed. And so somehow she found, through Neighbors Inc., the house that we then rented for, it was over a decade, 10, 15 years we rented the same house. And then she ended up buying it from the people we had rented it from for all of those years. But it was through this organization. And then she was very active in the organization. I remember as a kid folding the Neighbors Inc. newsletters on the dining room table, like, you know, and be able to then put the sticker on and then send them out. So in that time, so growing up in DC basically in the 1970s, it was a time of a lot of activism. DC was very much Chocolate City. We lived in an area where there were a couple of other biracial families, but and then some white families, and much of the neighborhood was African American. And navigating all of those spaces as a person who is as light-skinned as I am was always a challenge, because I never felt like I belonged anywhere, because the other thing you need to know about me as a child is that I was extremely shy. So I was extraordinarily shy. So all I wanted to do was like, you know, hide in a cupboard or somewhere, or don't look at me, because I knew that we didn't fit in to the neighborhood, even though they were trying to make this work and trying to make it welcoming.
And this Neighbor Inc.
Neighbors Inc.
Neighbors Inc. Can you say a little bit about that organization?
So it was founded in the, I think it was the early to mid 60s, again, specifically to make these neighborhoods welcoming and integrated. It wanted to say, we don't need to let these forces of the fear of the white families who are fleeing in droves to the suburbs, and then the kind of the scalping that was going on with the real estate for African American families coming in. And so they formed specifically as neighbors to be able to do welcoming, to welcome, to encourage the neighbors who are already there to stay, and welcome the new neighbors who were coming in. And so it was, what I remember most were the social activities. I mean, I was a child, so I remember there were Neighbors Inc. dances, and there were Neighbors Inc. potlucks. There was, my mom was the one who put together the whole newsletter. Like, I don't remember reading the newsletter to know what was actually in it, but the archives are hopefully somewhere, I don't know. But I do remember folding it. But so what I remember was more that just kind of focus on welcoming and being a neighborhood that of neighbors who knew each other and who encouraged each other. DC, when I was growing up, was you know, as I said, it was definitely Chocolate City. It was absolutely African American, and it was Southern in many aspects. And part of that Southernness meant that you spoke to your neighbors. You never passed someone in your neighborhood on the street without saying hello, right? You know, good morning, good afternoon, people sitting out on their porches. We didn't have air conditioning. I grew up in a house with no central air. And so as kids, you know, we'd be packs of kids roaming the neighborhoods, you know, in the evenings when it finally got a little bit cooler in the summer. But it was very much a, you know, make sure you greet your neighbors kind of thing, which old DC still is. And then it was also a more, I grew up with a more formal towards adults. So it was Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. Because it was 70s and women's lib was coming around. But you would always, you know, so anyone who worked for the DC government, the postal carrier, and a neighbor who was slightly older than you, in the Black community, it was always Mr. or Ms. So Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. White, Mr. Smith. And yet on my white friends, they would call their friends' parents by their first names. And so I remember as a kid, one of those being one of those cultural things that you had to remember to switch between. So, you know, Ellen, you had to navigate that. Shannon's mom was Eleanor, you know, but, you know, someone else's mom was Mrs. Smith. And that was some of those. So even though there was a group that was trying to bring together, you still had some of these very strong cultural norms that were very distinct in terms of how they came up.
Where is today? Today, you mentioned old DC, which is still around. Can you describe where that is and what that's like?
It's a lot in our memories. DC has really changed. So I've always thought of DC as 3 cities in one. And that is, there's local DC, there's federal DC, and there's international DC. And I have been privileged to be able to be part of all of those communities, and yet for much of my life felt like I never really fully belonged to any of them. But the local DC was the DC that I grew up in. It was the DC of the folks, you know, I know DC families that have been here for generations and generations. I cannot claim myself as a native Washingtonian because we came here when I was 4. So I wasn't born here. And if you're DC, you know that you got to be born on our soil in order to be able to be a native Washingtonian. So I know families that have generations dating back of Washington, D.C. And we were often the federal workers at lower levels. So the secretaries, the mailroom, the drivers, the clerks, that kind of DC. Then you had the federal DC where you had people from all over the US coming in to take federal jobs. So when I was growing up in DC, the federal government was the employer. Right now it's like there's a restaurant scene and there's a tech scene out in Northern Virginia and Amazon is coming in and all this kind of stuff, but it really was the employer. My dad, as a journalist, working for, we came when he worked for the AP and then he worked for the Washington Post. And so working for the Washington Post, he wasn't working in the federal government. It was after my parents divorced that my mom actually went to work in the federal government. And then, so the federal DC was the DC of people who have come in from other places in the country to work for and serve in the federal government. And then, of course, there's international DC of all the embassies and the World Bank and all of the kind of international community. And when I was coming up in DC, the immigrant community was really, so this would have been in the 70s, it was Vietnamese refugees. So it was the first start of the Vietnamese refugees coming in. It was before El Salvadorans, before Ethiopians. You did have in Adams Morgan very much of a Latino community back in the 70s. But it wasn't kind of the surge that came from El Salvador from the war in the 80s that came in. So there were those DCs, and my DC growing up was the local DC.
What did your mother study at Stanford?
Chemistry.
Chemistry?
Yeah, which she never used.
And,
Yeah.
and your father went into journalism?
My dad did journalism. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
I see.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
your mother's job in
So she was, she had kids, had us all, and then was basically, a housewife for the first 10 years. And then when she realized that the marriage wasn't going to work out and she needed to figure out how to raise 4 children just on her own, she, one of the things she looked at is that, having not ever used her chemistry, having not had a job for 10 years, it was going to be very, basically she could be a secretary, and that wasn't going to be, she felt, enough income to be able to raise us. So she got herself a scholarship to go to Georgetown and went to law school. So when I was in the 6th grade, when I was in the 6th grade, she said to my dad, I got a full scholarship, I'm going to Georgetown, I'm leaving the house for 3 years and then I'll come back and take care of the kids. So at that point, she got an apartment on Capitol Hill, and my dad had to take a position. So he traveled a lot because he was all the time traveling, particularly covering the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And so he needed to be now in DC because now he was going to be taking care of us for these 3 years. So Monday through Friday, we had my dad, who they assigned him to the White House beat, which for most reporters is like a prize, and he hated it. He hated it, but there was very little travel on the White House beat in those days. The president, it would have been Carter, I guess. Yeah, President Carter didn't travel that much internationally. And so they assigned him to and it was one of these deals where you wait until the press spokesperson comes out and gives you, and then you write up your story, and then, you can go home. So it was very different.
He was probably bored.
He hated it. You told us how much he hated it. So Monday through Friday, we would be with my dad, and then on the weekends, my mom would come back, and my dad would go. So we stayed in the same house And so it was my parents who moved in and out for those years until my mom then finished law school, and she took a job with the federal government as a lawyer because of the security. So she decided that she wanted something that was going to be very secure to be able to raise her kids. And then my dad moved out at that point, and then he went to LA to work for the Los Angeles Times, and then worked for the Oakland Tribune, and then taught journalism for many years, and he's now retired. So at San Francisco State. Yeah, so he's been in the Bay Area he's been in Oakland for a long time. Yeah.
And your mother?
So she's here. She's still here. Yeah, she. I'm a career foreign service officer, and when I came back from living in Nairobi in Kenya in 1998 with my then year-and-a-half-year-old daughter and my husband, she came back, and we were looking for a house and trying to figure out where we were going to buy and what we were going to do, because I had been at that point living out of the U.S. for 11 years. And my then husband had never lived in the United States. He's Guatemalan. And so we came back, and we were looking around, and my sister and brother-in-law at that point, they were both in graduate school, and they had come to DC and were living with my mom in the house that we grew up with. And that was not a situation that could last for a long time, let's just put it that way. And so we came back, and we started looking for a house, and my sister and brother-in-law were like, oh, well, maybe we'll start looking for a house. And my mom was like, wait a second, I was saving this house for you. And we were like, what? You never said anything. No one ever told us that. So we made the decision. So my mom decided then to sell the house to my sister and brother-in-law. And then she went and she found an apartment in Southwest. So right on what is now that whole wharf area. But she's been living down in Southwest since 1998, before all of the gentrification, before all of the changes. And at that time, particularly during so this would have been 2000 this was 1998. And during the 1990s, one of the most integrated areas of DC was actually that Southwest area, particularly in terms of income distribution. So you had in that Southwest area people in public housing, and then you had these co-ops, apartment buildings that had come out of the raising of all of what had been a really vibrant Black community there when they brought the highways through. So all of that got raised in the 60s, I guess it was. And then they built all of these other housing. And so you had folks who had these penthouse views looking out over the Potomac, very expensive housing, right next door to people who were in public housing. And there were very few areas of DC that had that kind of different kinds of people of different kinds of income living together at that point. Now, again, it's all gentrified and young, and lots of little tiny small apartments and that kind of stuff.
It's changed.
But it's going to change quite a bit.
You mentioned earlier that something to the effect, and if I'm saying it wrong, please correct me, but something to the effect that you have not felt at home in any of those. Could you elaborate? Could you explain?
Sure. It's one of these things that as a kid, you're trying to figure out where you belong, right? I think that's a natural human instinct for all of us as children. How do I fit in? How do I belong? Where are my people? What's my community? It can come from the neighborhood around you. It can come from your heritage. It can come from a lot of different places. But when you grow up like me, where you are one thing, I am a Black woman, but the world sees you as something else, then there's this constant confrontation and tension that goes on. And it took me many, many, many years to come to grips with that. So I was extremely shy and didn't want to have to confront anybody about anything as a child. That's just how I was. And so I don't know, you may remember back in the in the days of the old jokes when they would say, "What's black and white and red all over a newspaper?" Right? It's like this joke does not work in the social media age anymore. But I used to get taunted at school with "What's black and white and red all over Marianne," because I would flush red if you looked at me funny. If you like gave me a side eye walking down the hall, I would turn the color of these chairs. And that was just like, I just blushed. That was part of my physiology. I don't know, I couldn't control it. So that would be the joke constantly when I was a kid, was "What's black and white and red all over Marianne?" So it was, kids do stuff like that where they state the obvious, but it also means that it's a constant reminder that you're not here and you're not there. And for me, it was once I was had gone to college. So I often say that my biggest cultural shock was actually when I went to college. It wasn't, I've now lived all over the world. I've lived in Africa, I've lived in throughout South America, Central America. I've traveled a lot, and my biggest cultural shock was still that when I left my DC public, it wasn't DC public, it was a DC Catholic high school, a very small school. We were 98 girls in the graduating class. There were 2 white girls, 2 of us were mixed, 2 Vietnamese, and everyone else was African American. And going from that high school experience to, I also went to Stanford University, to a full scholarship at Stanford, where all of a sudden, like, I was just, I'll never forget, for me it was like sweats. People were wearing sweatpants to class, and I was like, you dress when you're going out, no, I was brought up that you dress when you're going to church and you dress when you're leaving your house. And yeah, this was the 70s, and so I went around barefoot a lot of the time. But if I was going to a class or going to school or going to here or going to there, you dress. And you're wearing sweatpants? Like, what is this? You're hanging outside on the lawn in a bikini? Like, it was like, whoa, where am I? And when I went to college, I expected to study environmental science. That's what I really had a passion for. And in those days, environmental science was science. It was hard sciences. I think if they'd had urban environment, that kind of stuff, how your environment affects you, I would have gone to those. But it was, it was birds and trees and science, and I couldn't pass chemistry. And chemistry for me, I couldn't pass the class. And if you couldn't pass chemistry, then you couldn't get a degree in environmental science. So I was like, what am I going to do? And that's when I don't even remember how I found out, but I found out that if you went to one of Stanford's study abroad programs and you had a full scholarship, which I had, a tuition scholarship, they would just up your tuition to pay for the abroad program. So I was like, oh, all right, let me go someplace else. And, I then had to get my first passport and left, and I went to England because I didn't speak any other languages. And that was one of those experiences that just opened up my, wait a second, there are all of these different ways to be in this world. You can take what you were given, you can take what you've learned, you can take all of this stuff, and then you can transform it into other ways of being and interacting and culture and challenging your own assumptions, right? You always learn more about your own country whenever you go abroad. Like, you first come to realize what it is that you had always thought was truth, and then you get to another country and it is so not truth. And you're like, oh, wow, okay. I thought everyone ate at 6. No, not necessarily. When you're having beans for breakfast, like, there's small things, and then there are big things about who you are and how you interact and how you deal with society that also. So that for me was one of those kind of transforming experiences. And then what I ended up doing was taking that discomfort that I had as a child of you don't fit in, and realizing that that ability to cross between cultures was actually my superpower. And so what had been for me the hardest part about being a child became then something that I realized that I could cross across different cultures and try to then understand and meet people where they were. And that is just the funnest thing in the world. That is really
and
the fun
that
part.
positive skill, that asset of being able to go
Right.
from culture to culture.
But it came from that I don't fit in.
Exactly.
I
Sure.
don't belong.
Yeah.
I don't belong.
But I think there are, I mean, please help me with this. I think not belonging, a person who feels they don't belong, they must have intuitive skills. They must, I mean, observational. Do people like that? Or in your case, was there a tendency to be aware of this not belonging, but also observing why you might not?
I don't know
Or
how.
were you not-
I mean, I tend to be a very introspective person.
Okay.
I don't know whether that came from the constantly feeling like an outsider,
Okay.
or whether I had that skill and that's what made me
Okay.
like real, not.
So
So I don't know which one it was.
came- okay.
But when you look like me, and you know who you are, and you voice who you are, I'm a biracial black woman. I cannot tell you the number of people from many different communities who look at me and they say, "No, you're not." And it's like, wow, really? You're going to tell me who I am? And it's happened my whole life. People will just say, "No, you're not. No, you're not." And it's like, okay, first that shows how little you understand about the African American experience in the United States. That's how little you understand about what has happened to our people over all of these years, and the mixing of different kinds of ethnicities that has happened, and yet we have still stuck together as an African American community. But also, wow, that's bold. Like you just denied me to the you just
right?
like, yeah, they said, "No, you're not."
Defining you,
You're not.
telling you who you are.
And I understand that I do not have the experience that my brothers have had. I'm the only one with freckles in the family. So these came from, one of my mother's grandparents, I think it was Irish, at least one. So, they that's the irony of my mother's parents kicking her out, is that she ended up with children who look like me. And it's like, you kicked it out before she even had kids. And you had no idea that the skin tone was going to end up more like your side of the family than the other side of the family. Like you didn't know that. But it's also that how you think of yourself versus how others think of you. I've never had the experience my brothers have had of having someone cross the street when I walk down the street, right? I don't present as threatening in any way. If I stop a policeman and say I need help, they're going to believe me, right? That cop is going to believe me. Not necessarily my friends, my cousins, my brothers, other people in my family. They may not be believed. But if I'm distraught and going down the street and I stop a cop and say I need help, they're not going to assume I'm on drugs, right? Because of the way I look. Right? I mean, now I'm, a woman in my 50s, so I don't think but at any rate, throughout my whole life,
Sure.
it's been that they would never do that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because of the skin.
Because of the skin tone. Because we're still a nation that judges people on skin tone.
So then you finished at Stanford.
I did.
So you decided to major in something.
I majored in international relations.
International relations.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then after that?
And then I joined the Foreign Service.
Uh-huh.
So that's when then I joined the Foreign Service and I joined a year. So I came into the Foreign Service a year after I finished college. So I was 22, and I joined to be able to do cultural work, because that's where my passions were and still are, was on the cultural affairs side. Educational exchange for me was what literally opened up the world. And so particularly for me, the educational and cultural exchanges are just so vital to building international understanding, and to having each of us be able to get out of our own preconceived notions and see things in a different way. And so that for me has been really, really important.
Very nice.
So that's what I've dedicated my career to.
Yes. And you're still living in DC?
I was in Bolivia until 2020, and and the house across the street from the house I grew up in, where my sister and brother-in-law live, came on the market. And I was like, that's my house. Like, knew I was coming back in 2020, and like this thing, and so I live across the street from where I grew up. So 39 years after leaving Tacoma, I am back in Tacoma. So.
Would you like to talk a little bit about, I mean, you've had this amazing experience as someone who's, people tell you that you're not Black, but you've lived in this very interesting place of your own, so to speak. How would you describe today the problem of racism in America? How would you, where are we with this issue?
We are still, racism is still absolutely embedded throughout all of our society. It's still systemic. It's still something that we have not truly come to grips with as a country. What the legacy of hundreds and hundreds of years of holding people as property and considering them less than has done. And every time we have tried to make progress, there has been a backlash. And what I see now is that we are in the midst of one of those backlashes again. And that is because we haven't really, other countries have had truth and reconciliation, commissions. Other countries have made a point to build new constitutions that, eliminate some of the ills that led to what the slave was. I'm not advocating for a new U.S. Constitution. I think that our document is solid and has stood, and I don't think we should go down that route. But I do think we have to really come to a reckoning in this country about the legacy that this continued putting people in second class based on their color of their skin, and the African American culture has thrived in spite of that. Like, if there's ever a positive, vibrant American, it is a African American woman with hope for the future, bringing children into this world to say we can do a better job. There is a possibility. Because of all of the different forces and systemic forces and embedded forces that are against us. And that is something that I think we need to seriously look at, but that does mean really examining our many of the aspects of what we have always kind of considered, and in many ways, white society in America hasn't really ever had to think about it. And then, since the murder of George Floyd, there has been this looking at this, and what has it produced? Okay, in my now mostly white Tacoma neighborhood, you got Black Lives Matter signs all over the place.
It raised consciousness, but it really hasn't gone deep.
It's got to go deeper. It's got to go deeper. So the question then becomes, how do we look at the public policies? How do we look at the institutional policies? How do we look at various kinds of ways to make this systemic change? And that's where I feel that we really have to be. Some of it is going to be one-on-one, right? So we're talking about change that happens at all different kinds of level to be able to make that change. Some of it's going to be one-on-one. Some of it's going to be that person who would have said to me 10 years ago, "You're not black," saying, "Okay, I have educated myself more about, the community." And I would say it's not just white people who say that to me. I've had black people, I've had Latino people, I've had lots of people say to me like, no. So educating them about what the African American experience truly looks like, but also then looking at how we make that individual change. As someone who really has dedicated my career and my life towards educational and cultural exchange, I do think those transformative experiences one-on-one are really critical. But they also have to look at the overall public policy. And that is that how are we really instituting more equity and examining the different mechanisms and policies, right? So there's a great study that I was just reading about here for DC, looking at heat islands in DC and where things heat up, and then overlaying that with demographic information and indices of poverty. Well, guess what? The leafier areas are the cooler areas, the areas that are most likely to be able to be resistant to climate change, and they're the richer areas of town. So when we look at things like that and say, what do we need to do to get more trees into poor neighborhoods to be able to help provide that shade that is going to be needed as our city and our planet gets hotter and hotter and hotter as we go forward. And that's just a small example. Then there's access to education. Then there's the quality of the public schools. Then there's housing. Then there's wealth, building up wealth and whether you have avenues to do that. Then there's the fact that depending on your zip code, you get a different rate for your loan. Like there are all of these different areas.
Which is all policy.
Which is policy. But it's also having us as citizens, we have to call this stuff out. Because our policymakers have been, like these policies have been set over time and then they're not necessarily examined fully. So this is also where it's really important to have like a civic movement that looks at all of these different kinds of things and says, all right, y'all are going to attack that one and we're going to do this one and they're going to do that one. And we're going to look at all of this. The US as a country, I mean, I have represented my country abroad now for many, many years. And I try to represent the United States in all of our diversity with all of our good, bad, and ugly. And we have a lot of all of that. We're a very large country. We're a country of a lot of different kinds of people from all over the world, a lot of different ideas, a lot of different cultures, sometimes coming together and working together and sometimes going against each other. But we're a very complicated nation. And our role that we've played in the world has been equally complicated over time. And that complexity is not necessarily a bad thing when we make sure that we are all informed and activated in it. And that's where I feel like we're in part lagging behind, right? The number of people who vote, like how many people put their lives on the line to be able to give us all the right to vote. And now our, people like, what? Same old politicians, same old. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we're a very innovative country as well. And we can use that innovation, we can use that spirit. I know of no other country in the world where you have as much volunteerism as you have in the United States, where people are like, okay, there's a crisis, I'm gonna get on it and I'm gonna do my role and And the most generous people in our nation are actually our poorest people. The people who give the most, who do the most for others, are actually the people at the lowest end of the income scale. And there's been lots of studies that have looked at that. That's the spirit that can still transform us. And we haven't lost that. And so I do think that we can still make that. But there is a lot of work to be done. And just hanging up a sign isn't going to do it.
Exactly. Yes. I'm glad that that's your view of the signs,
Yeah.
because it's just not enough. Yeah.
It's just not enough. It's just not enough.
And do you have any advice for the younger generation of African Americans?
Know your history. Know own your voice and your experience, whatever part of the community it's from. Know that we are a very strong and large community that doesn't always accept everyone within our own community, but that's okay. You can still have your voice and your place within the community, and you've got to become civically active in whatever area interests you, whatever area it is, whether it's trees, whether it's rights, for children, whether it's like whether or not there's a stop sign on the corner, whether it's politics, like whatever area, we need you to be an active citizen. Vote. Always vote.
I just want to now go back to your father,
Mm-hmm.
and as a journalist for Associated Press,
Mm-hmm.
who covered the civil rights movement. Is
Mm-hmm. That's
that-
correct.
Okay, so can you say a little bit about that? I mean, did you ever talk to him about things that he wrote about? Or?
Some. My dad's still with us. He's out in California now.
Yes.
My dad was gone a lot of the time because of that movement. So, I knew, for example, that he was the one who broke the news on a lot of different key areas. My dad has this amazing ability to get out there and talk to anybody about anything. It's like one of the beautiful things about being a journalist, and he is so intellectually curious in terms of getting out there. He always, during my childhood, I remember him mostly with a full beard and a full fro. And I know that when he was had to go to the South, he would have to shave his beard sometimes to be able to look more respectable as a member of the press because of the attacks that happened. And particularly, there were very few African American in the mainstream media at that point in terms of covering that.
The attacks that happened.
So when he would go into the South, and he's covering various different parts of the civil rights movement, he would have to change his appearance to try to make sure that he looked like, a professional and not what some other person, like the police, thought was like a radical or something like that. That's the way the civil rights movement was also. People wore suits and ties on purpose. Women wore dresses on purpose. Like there was some of this was very kind of a purposeful, how you present matters in terms of making these changes. And then, he used to talk when I was young that I knew that he had an FBI file because they saw him as a subversive, as a black reporter. So when I joined the government to represent the government as a diplomat, he was very disappointed because he saw, the federal government particularly, here's a man who's had an FBI file, who's had to have the government follow him, and here I'm going to go and represent this country abroad. What's up with that? Particularly since I joined USIA, which is the cultural and media side, and I joined the cultural side, but he thought of the media side as propaganda, and that you're going to be out there engaging in propaganda. And I said, no, this is about telling the truth about our country, and I will tell you as part of my own career, that is what I will always strive to do. But he was still he was not happy with that. when that happened.
So he traveled a lot then for the.
He traveled domestically a lot.
That's what
Very,
he did
yeah.
to cover the movement.
Yeah, yeah. He traveled domestically a lot. Exactly.
And so he worked for first the Associated Press, then you said the
Washington Post.
and then the LA Times, and then Oakland
And then Oakland Tribune.
Tribune. Did you give us his name?
Austin, he's now Austin Longscott.
Okay.
He and his wife Ethel Longscott have been married since the 1980s. What does that make it? 40 years? Yeah, 40 years. Wow. Yeah, they're coming up on 40 years.
And your mother's name?
My mother's Joanne Scott.
Okay.
Yeah.